Welcome to I Love This Thing So Fricking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I'm joined by Karen, a person who likes art. Welcome to the show, Karen.
Hi.
Hi. So, here's how this works. Karen will have 3 minutes to talk about something that she loves. This can be a person, place, thing, concept, activity, anything she wants. Our only requirement is that she loves it wholeheartedly and wants to tell us why. Are you ready, Karen?
Sure.
Good. Got my timer here. Now, what do you love so fricking much?
I love Impressionist art. I am a painter and someone who enjoys paintings and looking at art, and I love Impressionist art specifically for two main reasons. The first is how it makes me feel, and the second is how it totally changed the course of Western art. I want to make clear that if I ever say, like, no one had done this before, I'm specifically talking about Western Europe or France specifically. I'm not trying to make broad, sweeping, global statements about art, just specifically about the culture that Impressionism developed into. But first of all, the way that Impressionism makes me feel is the way that it was designed to make people feel largely a sense of wonder and a sense of joy and a sense of beauty. Impressionism is designed to showcase beauty in a way that sucks you in and makes you feel that you're there. There's a sense of wonder I find in looking at these paintings, and especially a sense of beauty in the mundane. For example, if you look at Monet's Haystacks, Monet did a series of paintings of haystacks in, I think it was 1889, where he would go out to the same field near his town and paint two haystacks in a field full of haystacks 20 or 30 times. There's dozens of these paintings of haystacks, and they would be at different times of day and at different times of year and in different weather to try and capture the atmosphere and what changes and what's different. And so if you look at the paintings of the haystacks, they'll be wildly different in color and tone, and you can really get a sense of the atmosphere. You know what time of day it is just because of the colors he used. And in one of them, the shadows are a beautiful lilac, and then in another one, they're green, and it's the same haystack, but just because of the different qualities of light. The point being that he spent so much time finding what is beautiful in something as mundane as a haystack. That's like the point of a lot of Impressionism, is to take these things that you just take for granted and be like, but look at how the light is reflecting off of that. Isn't that gorgeous? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that worth your attention? And then the other thing that I love about Impressionism is how it totally changed Western art, because before that, in Renaissance and Baroque painting, there was a heavy emphasis on realism. Everything was photorealistic, extremely detailed. If you look at some of the Baroque masters, the Dutch masters, they were painting the lace on a lady's dress in such detail that I look at it and go, they don't make brushes that tiny. How did you do that?
Go ahead and finish your thought.
The point being that Impressionism was a move away from a lot of the things that Western art had valued, and a move towards what they thought was worth remembering and worth looking at, which had more to do with everyday people and everyday life and finding the beauty in that, and not such a rigid structure, but being more free, creative, and expressive.
That's awesome. Thank you for telling us about Impressionist art today.
You're welcome.
Let's start at the beginning. How did your interest in Impressionism begin?
Well, I was always an artistic kid. I always loved painting and stuff. And as I got older and I started looking at other styles of painting, the Impressionists were what drew me in. So my love for Impressionism really started as, that makes me want to paint. Mm-hmm. I look at that painting and I go, oh, I want to do that. I want to go home right now and bust out my paints and do that, because they were playing with color and they were doing things that made me feel inspired and made me feel something, feel an emotion when I look at it. And so it made me want to do that. So more so than some other styles of art that seemed a little more inaccessible, these felt like they were speaking directly to me. And then as I learned more about art history, because it is just a thing that I love to learn about. I'm not an art historian, this is just a hobby. Mm-hmm. As I learned more about the history of the Impressionists, more and more it stood out to me how cool it was as a movement that really changed how things worked in art, especially in France in the 1870s.
From the way that you described this shift from more realistic, maybe more serious, you have to take a lot more time to learn how to do kind of art, into an art that was by everyone for everyone. And I find it very interesting, very fitting that fits your story of how you got into it. that you looked at a painting and said, I could do that, I want to do that, that's for me.
Right. And I don't want to make it seem like it's because it's easy, because actually the interesting thing is if you look at the works of some of these famous artists, you know, Monet, Renoir, if you look at their earlier works, things from like the 1860s, they're a lot more in line with the Baroque works that came before them in terms of their style, the realism in their paint, the fact that you can't see their brush strokes. And then as they moved into Impressionism, they deliberately moved into this almost unfinished, because it was at the time, art critics thought that Impressionist works they look unfinished, but because you can see the brush strokes and stuff like that, but they were doing that deliberately. These artists were very highly trained, but yeah, they were deliberately, as you say, making it more accessible to the average people. Renaissance and Baroque art had like extremely limited subject matters. You could paint religious art, mythological art, historical art, still lifes, and portraiture. If you wanted to paint anything else, nobody will buy it, nobody will show it in a gallery.
You wouldn't just paint haystacks in a farm field.
You would never paint haystacks in a farm field. That would be insane. Whereas, as I said, the Impressionists, they wanted to paint like this painting, I might pronounce the French wrong, but La Balançoire by Renoir. It's these people in a garden. It's not nobility. They're talking to each other. One of them is on a swing. And we don't care about the lace or the bows on her dress, but we do care about the light and where the shadows fall. And also, I didn't mention earlier, but that was one of the big things that also changed about the Impressionists, is that they were painting outside. They called it plein air painting, which is just French for painting in the open air. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing at this point. So for the first time, we've got paints in little tubes. You didn't have to mix them in your studio.
Okay.
So before that, a painter had to paint in an established studio because that's where all your stuff is. But now we've got little tubes. You can pack everything up into a little suitcase and throw your easel over your shoulder and grab a canvas and trek out into the countryside and paint all day.
And paint a landscape.
Which
you can see because you're looking at the landscape.
You're looking at the landscape, which is why, as I mentioned, the Haystacks, he was so concerned about how the light changed. Mm-hmm. That's not something they ever would have painted before, because you couldn't sit out there and watch how the light changed. You had to be inside.
It sounds like a lot of different historical things were falling into place at the right moment.
Exactly.
This wasn't just a change in philosophy about what could be art. It is actually physically now we can do things that we couldn't do before, and more people can make art than could make it before.
And it's both at the same time. And it's also relevant the way French society was changing at the time. You know, this is post-French Revolution, also post-Napoleon. France is still figuring out who they want to be. They don't have a nobility anymore, so we're not painting the nobility. We're focused on these ideals of freedom and equality, and so the painters are more concerned about painting everyday life, and so they're trying to romanticize the people in the countryside and things like that, or you know, an average person on a swing or something. Also, photography. Like, photography wasn't great at the time, but it existed, and they knew that it was going to get better.
Yeah.
And so the idea that painters are the only ones who can capture what had happened, painters are the historians.
Capturing something realistically.
That's starting to go by the wayside. And suddenly the painters are going, what if we're concerned less about what it physically looked like and more about the feeling you had at the time, which is where we get the name Impressionism.
Is there anything that you don't like about Impressionism? And if so, how do you handle that?
I mean, as you delve into the history of anything, you're going to find some problematic characters, so there's that.
Yeah.
I mostly let the works speak for themselves, because it's long enough ago that you don't need to worry about quote-unquote supporting a problematic artist. They've been dead for 100 years. But there isn't that much about Impressionism that I dislike. There may be certain paintings that I like more or less than others, but that's going to be true of any art movement. I'm going to have my favorites. If there is anything about Impressionism that I don't like, the way I handle it is by looking at a different painting, because I'm not required to look at that one.
Do you have any recommendations for someone who is interested in getting started and looking into Impressionist art and they just don't know where to start?
I absolutely do. Okay, so the first thing is, if you live in a city that's large enough to have any kind of art museum, go to it, read all the plaques, get the little pamphlet that tells you what is in each room, and because there'll be a blurb that's written by an actual art historian who's trying to give you a vibe for this painting. Talk to the people who are there to talk about art. I promise they want to talk about art. So yeah, if you're in like a Chicago, for example, go to the Chicago Art Museum. They have, for example, several of Monet's Haystacks. I loved looking at them. But for a lot of us, I live in a rural area, so going to an art museum like that is something I do on a rare occasion. But a lot of these things are on the internet. In fact, a lot of museums have most of their collection on the internet, so you can explore their websites. I'm going to give you the links to various websites. One of them, the Orsay Museum in Paris, which I was able to go to a few years ago. It's incredible. I was moved to tears by this painting in particular, the Edgar Degas dance class painting, because I had a sudden sense memory of seeing a print of that in my dance studio growing up. So the Orsay in Paris is the best collection of Impressionist art in the world because all of these artists were Parisian. Basically, their entire collection is online. They also have a lot of articles. If you're like, well, I don't even know what to start looking at, look at some of their articles because they kind of guide you. It'll give you some history of what's going on here and who to look at rather than just going, I don't know, this is confusing. But the other thing I would say, and this is something that I tell anyone who's never taken like a college level art class or an art history or art appreciation class, is that we often don't give art enough time because it's a static image. So we look at it and then we're like, okay, well, I've seen it, and then you move on. But art is not made to be looked at for 10 seconds. I described it to my husband recently as that's like listening to the first 10 seconds of a song and being like, I've heard the whole song. Sometimes you listen to the first 10 seconds and you go, this isn't for me, and you move on. That's fine. But if you listen to the first 10 seconds and you think this is a cool song, you listen to the whole 3 minutes. That's what you have to do with art. If you look at it and you go, that's cool, sit with it. The composition is specifically designed to move your eye in a certain way. You have to let it work on you. You have to sit there and watch it and try not to dictate where your eye goes, but let the painting move your eye where it wants you to go, because there will be a path through the painting for you to follow that you don't really see, but your eye will follow it anyway. Sit there with it and think, what is this painting making me feel? What is this painting making me think of? What does it remind me of? Because the other point of art is that you're going to bring your own experience to it. That's normal, that's encouraged, that's perfect. So when you're looking at a painting from, 1870, you're bringing your modern context to it. So you're not going to experience it the same way that someone did in 1870, but that's perfectly fine. When I look at this painting of the dancers, I bring my context as someone who learned to dance in the 2000s. And I look at it and I see what's the same and what's different. And I have this feeling of like, I know what music was playing in that room. I can feel it.
Karen, thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
You're welcome.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you'd like to learn more about Impressionism, Karen gave us links to a bunch of museums, which you can find in the episode description. And if you have something you love so fricking much you want to tell me all about it, consider this your invitation to join the show. I Love This Thing So Fricking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed and edited by Sophie A. Katz. You can find us at Through the Window on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. That is THROU the Window at all those social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.